Frank Beard, the drummer for ZZ Top, has died at 77. He passed away Tuesday at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, with his family by his side.
Billy Gibbons has lost his voice twice in 5 years, and this time no one is left standing beside him to share the grief. Frank Beard, the drummer who kept ZZ Top's heartbeat steady for 56 years, died inside a quiet ranch house outside Houston. And for 3 days, his closest friend said almost nothing at all. Then Gibbons finally spoke, and what he revealed about those final months left fans unsettled. The announcement that changed everything. On Monday, August 17, 2026, ZZ Top's world went silent, in a way it had only gone silent once before. Frank Beard, the band's drummer since its earliest days in Houston, died in hospice care at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, with his family close beside him, at the age of 77. The confirmation came first from Bob Merlis, the band's longtime publicist, whose brief statement to reporters became the first official word before anything appeared on the band's own social media accounts. Within a day, it had reached every corner of the rock world that had grown up on his backbeat, catching plenty of casual fans off guard, since many of them had only just seen tour dates advertised weeks earlier and had no real sense of how serious things had become behind the scenes. No official cause of death has been released, and the medical examiner's office in Fort Bend County has already said there will be no autopsy, which means the exact circumstances of his final hours may never be made fully public. What we do know is harder to hear than any headline could capture. ZZ Top had been in the middle of a run of shows billed as the Big One Tour when Beard's health forced the band to pull back, and just 12 days before he passed, the group had already canceled a scheduled performance at the Hollywood Bowl. Fans in that crowd noticed something was wrong, but almost no one guessed how serious it had actually become. 2 more shows were canceled in the days immediately after his death, one in Salt Lake City and one in Colorado Springs, as the band and Gibbons tried to process a loss none of them seemed fully prepared for. That timeline matters because it tells you this was not a sudden shock the way some celebrity deaths are. It was a slow, visible decline that the band tried to manage quietly while still giving fans the shows they had paid for. And that kind of quiet suffering, carried out mostly in private, while the public only sees the canceled dates, is something a lot of us recognize from our own families. It makes what came next from Gibbons even harder to hear. Gibbons breaks his silence. It took a full day before Billy Gibbons said anything in public at all. And if you know his history, that silence tells you something on its own. He is a man who rarely lets a tribute pass without marking it properly. Yet this time he waited, and the statement, when it finally came, read like something written by a man still working through his own shock. He wrote that he and bassist Elwood Francis had lost a great friend and collaborator, and he called Beard one of the most naturally innovative drummers he had ever known. He added that Beard's steady backbeat had been essential to keeping the band at the top of its game for 6 decades, a small phrase that carried the full weight of everything the two of them had built together. That phrase matters more than it might seem, because Gibbons has spent more than 5 decades around some of the most respected musicians alive, and he chose those specific words for the man who sat behind him on stage for 56 years. Notice, too, that Gibbons chose to name Elwood Francis directly in that same statement, rather than speaking only for himself, a small detail that tells you exactly who Gibbons considers his closest remaining partner through this whole ordeal. He confirmed that the band intends to keep touring, describing it plainly as honoring exactly what Beard would have wanted. And anyone who has followed this band closely will recognize that sentence immediately, because it is nearly identical to the promise Gibbons made after losing Dusty Hill back in 2021. That repetition is not a coincidence. And it is not lazy writing on the band's part either. It is a man returning to the only language he has left for grief this large, the language of the road, of shows that must go on, because stopping feels like a second death. If you have ever lost someone and caught yourself repeating the same coping phrase you used the last time tragedy hit your family, you already understand exactly what Gibbons is doing here, whether he realizes it consciously or not. What his statement did not include was almost as telling as what it did. There was no mention of a cause of death, no mention of a funeral, and no mention of what happens to the drum chair that Beard occupied for 56 consecutive years. Those silences were about to be filled in by a story that stretched back much further than most fans realized, the signs nobody wanted to read. Rewind to March of 2025, back when ZZ Top was midway through what was called the Elevation Tour, and Frank Beard temporarily stepped away from the road, citing what the band's management described only as a health issue requiring his focus in the near term. At the time, the language was careful and optimistic, the kind of statement bands release when they genuinely believe a member will be back within weeks. Longtime drum technician John Douglas filled in for him, which was not actually the first time Douglas had been called on in an emergency. He is not some outside hire brought in for a single crisis. Douglas has been part of the band's live crew for more than 20 years, which meant Beard always had someone he trusted completely, waiting just off stage whenever his body needed a break. Back in 2002, during a European tour, Beard needed emergency surgery in Paris, and Douglas sat in behind the kit for what was, at that point, the first show the trio had ever played without one of its 3 original members in 33 years together. Reporting that surfaced later confirmed the 2025 departure was tied to serious foot and ankle problems, an injury that sounds minor on paper but becomes brutal when your career depends on hours behind a drum kit. Beard did return to the lineup for a stretch of shows afterward, and for a while it looked like the worst had passed. But drummer Michael Monaghan also began filling in at certain dates through 2026, including a show in Saratoga, California, a detail that suggests his health was becoming unpredictable rather than simply healing in a straight line. Then came the Hollywood Bowl cancellation on August 5th, one of the most visible venues in the country, and for longtime fans, that cancellation landed differently than the earlier ones had. It felt less like a temporary setback, and more like a warning none of us read correctly at the time. Looking back now, the pattern is impossible to miss. A body that had absorbed 56 years of touring, finally beginning to give out in ways that could no longer be quietly managed from behind the scenes. To really understand why Gibbons refused to let this loss end the band, you have to go back 5 years, to the summer he had to write almost this same sentence for a different friend. 2 goodbyes and 1 broken brotherhood. 5 years before this week, in the summer of 2021, Billy Gibbons faced a nearly identical moment. And if you were paying attention back then, you already know how much it cost him. Dusty Hill, ZZ Top's bassist since 1970, died suddenly in his sleep at his home in Houston at the age of 72. And the band's announcement at the time was short, warm, and clearly written by 2 men still in shock, Gibbons and Beard together, calling Hill their compadre and promising he would be missed. Within days, longtime guitar technician Elwood Francis stepped in to fill the bass role, and the band played its first show without Hill in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, with Gibbons telling the crowd that Dusty gave me the directive, a phrase that instantly became part of ZZ Top's story of survival. What almost nobody talks about, though, is what that moment actually meant for Frank Beard, the man standing beside Gibbons through it. He had just lost a bandmate of more than 5 decades, someone he had played alongside since long before ZZ Top even existed, and he had to keep drumming through that grief while helping steady Gibbons at the same time. That same stretch of shows asked him to carry a kind of double duty that rarely gets mentioned when people talk about how gracefully the band handled that loss, burying his own grief just enough each night to keep performing while quietly propping up the one bandmate he had left. Now, 5 years later, there is no Frank Beard left to lean on, and no Dusty Hill either. Gibbons is standing completely alone as the only original member of a band that once defined itself by never changing its lineup for more than half a century. This is the detail most tribute videos this week are going to miss entirely, because they will treat this as one more sad rock death instead of what it actually is. The second half of a story that began 5 years ago and has now closed a circle Gibbons never wanted to complete. Losing one brother is devastating enough, but losing both, 5 years apart, while being the one left to keep writing the tribute statements each time, is a specific and brutal kind of grief that very few public figures ever have to carry twice. To understand how a man carries that kind of weight twice and still walks back on stage, you have to go back to how this unlikely brotherhood started in the first place, because it almost never happened at all. The man who almost never joined the band. Frank Lee Beard was born on June 11, 1949, in the small town of Frankston, Texas, and grew up in Irving, where he attended Irving High School long before anyone knew his name. Long before ZZ Top existed, he was already deep inside the Texas blues scene, playing alongside a young Dusty Hill in a string of bands most people have never heard of, including American Blues, the Warlocks, the Hustlers, and the Cellar Dwellers. One detail from those early years almost never makes it into ZZ Top retrospectives, and it says everything about how strange the music business was at the time. Beard actually spent part of his early career touring as a member of a fake version of the British band, the Zombies, a group of American musicians performing under that name without the real band's knowledge, cashing in on a name that was not theirs to use. It was a common practice in that era, and it shows Beard was already a road-hardened musician long before fame found him. Gibbons himself had already had one earlier brush with something bigger before that, having fronted a psychedelic band called the Moving Sidewalks that once opened for Jimi Hendrix, who was reportedly impressed enough to tell people around him that Gibbons was one of the most promising young guitarists he had seen. That earlier taste of near stardom faded quickly, and by the time Beard suggested Dusty Hill's name in the final weeks of 1969, Gibbons was a talented guitarist without a steady band, still years away from knowing that the suggestion he was about to accept would define the rest of his life. The detail that changes everything, though, is this. It was Frank Beard, not Billy Gibbons, who first suggested that Gibbons audition Dusty Hill for his new project. Without that suggestion, the classic three-man lineup that lasted 56 years might never have existed at all. Gibbons has described their earliest days together at a Houston club called the Catacombs, the place where the pieces of what became ZZ Top first started fitting together. And then there is the joke that followed Beard for his entire career, the one built right into his own name. Behind that easy, self-deprecating humor, though, was a much darker chapter of his life that the band rarely discussed in public for years. By the late 1970s, ZZ Top had become one of the fastest rising bands in the country, and with that success came money that could destroy a person just as easily as it could reward one. In a documentary about the band's history released in 2019, Beard spoke with striking honesty about what happened to him during that period, describing how an entire $72,000 paycheck from 1977 disappeared within weeks, spent almost entirely on substances. He explained that it started with LSD moved into prescription pills, driven by the relentless demands of touring, and eventually became a serious addiction that took hold of him completely. In that same documentary, Beard admitted plainly that he never wanted to quit and never wanted to get fired, a line that lands differently once you understand just how close he actually came to losing the band through his own choices during those years. Dusty Hill, who watched his close friend go through this firsthand, spoke about it as well, saying in the documentary that as a friend you don't want to see him die, and that all you really want in that situation is to see your brother get well again. That single sentence from Hill tells you more about the bond between these three men than almost anything else on record, because it was not spoken as a bandmate protecting an investment, it was spoken as a brother terrified of losing someone he loved. The band made the difficult decision to go on hiatus for roughly 3 years in the late 1970s, specifically so Beard could get help, a choice that likely saved both his life and the band's future at the same time. He entered a structured rehabilitation program and committed to a 12-step recovery process. And by 1979, he had returned to the band completely sober, a state he reportedly maintained for the rest of his life. It is worth remembering that addiction stories from that era of rock rarely ended in recovery at all, which makes the 4 decades of sobriety that followed feel less like a footnote and more like the real achievement of his career. That means the band's most reliable presence, the man whose timing never wavered on stage for decades, spent the back half of his career fighting privately every day just to stay that steady. And almost none of us in the audience ever had any idea. The quiet life behind the beard that never grew. Not long after getting sober, Beard married Debbie Meredith in 1982, and the two of them built a life together that stood in sharp contrast to the wild reputation Z-Top carried through the 70s and 80s. He is survived by his wife and 3 children, and for years he lived quietly on a ranch in Richmond, Texas, the same property where he would eventually spend his final days surrounded by family rather than fans or cameras. That kind of quiet stability was not something the band's chaotic 70s image ever suggested was possible, yet it defined the second half of his life almost completely. 4 decades built around family, land, and the same 56-year commitment to a band that once nearly consumed him. That contrast matters more than it might first appear, because so much of what the public knew about Frank Beard came filtered through sunglasses, stage lights, and the same 3 chords played thousands of times across 5 decades. The private version of the man was almost never on display, and the little we do know suggests someone who valued that privacy deeply and protected it carefully. In the 2019 documentary, Beard summed up his entire relationship with the band and the music in one honest, unpretentious line, saying he had found the people he was meant to play with. There is no dramatic flourish in that sentence, just a plain statement from a man who had already survived addiction, watched a bandmate die once, and kept showing up anyway. Gibbons has talked about how strange it becomes to spend that much time with the same 2 people for decades, saying their behaviors on stage became so familiar the band could almost anticipate each other's next move without speaking. That kind of closeness, built over 56 years of buses, hotel rooms, and thousands of shows, is not something most working relationships ever come close to, and it is part of why this loss feels so different from a typical celebrity death for fans who have followed the band closely. This was not a co-worker relationship dressed up in rock and roll clothing. It was something closer to family, tested repeatedly, and never broken. And that same closeness is exactly what fans could feel every time the 3 of them took the stage, in a sound that only existed because of exactly who they were, the sound only 3 men could make. By the time ZZ Top reached the 1980s, the trio had already reinvented itself once, moving from raw blues rock in the early years into the synthesizer-heavy sound that defined the album Eliminator in 1983. That record turned Sharp Dressed Man and Legs into inescapable staples of early MTV, built around a visual identity almost as recognizable as the music itself. Three men in matching sunglasses and hats, two of them buried behind waist-length beards, standing beside a customized hot rod that became nearly as famous as any of them individually. The band picked up multiple MTV Video Music Awards during that stretch, cementing an image that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with three very specific personalities occupying three very specific roles that could not be swapped out or duplicated. Gibbons has joked for years that the actual secret to the band's longevity came down to something refreshingly simple, admitting that keeping separate tour buses so everyone had room to breathe did more for the band's survival than any grand strategy ever could. Even the running joke about Frank Beard's own name became part of the band's identity. Gibbons has said in interviews that nobody in the band could ever quite explain how a man named Beard ended up playing drums between two guitarists with chin whiskers down to their chests, admitting with a laugh, "We still don't know." That kind of self-aware humor, poking fun at their own image instead of taking it too seriously, is part of why ZZ Top connected with audiences who might have otherwise dismissed them as a novelty act built around facial hair. Even after their final studio album, La Futura, arrived in 2012, the band kept touring for well over a decade on the strength of songs written decades earlier. Proof that audiences were not simply nostalgic for a moment in time, but genuinely invested in three specific musicians continuing to show up together. None of that visual or musical identity can be separated from Frank Beard specifically. He was not an interchangeable drummer keeping time in the background. He was one-third of a very specific joke, a very specific sound, and a very specific chemistry that took decades to build, and cannot simply be replaced by hiring someone with similar technical skill. That exact chemistry only ever had 3 seats, and for the past 5 years, watching who was allowed to sit quietly in one of them has said everything about how seriously this band took loyalty. The last man beside him. There is one person who has now stood beside Billy Gibbons through both losses, and his story deserves more attention than it usually gets. Elwood Francis spent decades working as Gibbons's personal guitar technician, tuning instruments and managing gear from just off stage, long before anyone outside the crew knew his name. When Dusty Hill died in 2021, Elwood was the obvious choice to step into the bass role. Not because of star power or industry connections, but because he had spent years absorbing the band's rhythms and habits from close range, learning the songs from the inside rather than studying them from a distance. He reportedly grew out his own beard specifically as a quiet tribute to Hill once he joined the lineup, a small personal gesture that said more about genuine loyalty than any official statement could have. 5 years later, when Gibbons finally spoke publicly after Beard's death, Elwood was the only other person named directly in that statement, referred to simply as part of the "we" who had lost a friend and collaborator. That detail alone tells you how far Elwood's role has evolved since those early days working quietly behind the scenes. He is no longer a hired replacement filling a gap. He has become the person Gibbons leans on through both of the worst moments this band has ever faced, the closest thing to a remaining creative partner that Gibbons has left in the world. Consider what it must feel like to watch your longtime boss lose his 2 oldest friends within 5 years of each other, while being asked each time to help hold the band together through the grief. That is the position Elwood Francis occupies right now, whether fans fully appreciate it or not. And within hours of Beard's death, it became clear that Gibbons and Elwood were not the only ones grieving a loss that reached far beyond this one band. Within hours of the announcement, tributes began arriving from corners of the music world that had nothing directly to do with ZZ Top, which tells you something about how far Beard's influence actually reached over 56 years. The band Govett Mule paused their own performance at Pine Creek Lodge in Livingston, Montana, that same night to pay tribute to him from the stage, a small but genuine gesture from fellow musicians who understood exactly what had been lost. That kind of spontaneous tribute from a fellow touring band says something a scripted label statement never could. Beard's place in music history had already been formally recognized back in 2004, when ZZ Top was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, with Keith Richards himself delivering the induction speech. A rare honor from one of rock's most respected elder statesmen. Long before this week's tributes, the band's reach had also been confirmed in a 2011 tribute album, where artists including Daughtry, Nickelback, and Steven Tyler of Aerosmith each recorded their own versions of ZZ Top classics, proof that respect for this rhythm section already extended across genres and generations well before anyone had to mourn it. His drumming is stitched permanently into songs that most listeners over 50 have heard hundreds of times without necessarily knowing his name. Tracks like La Grange, Tush, Sharp Dressed Man, Gimme All Your Lovin' and Legs. If you compare this outpouring to what happened after Dusty Hill's death in 2021, when musicians like Slash and Flea shared their own tributes, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This is now the second time in 5 years that the entire rock community has had to stop and mourn a piece of ZZ Top. And each time, the tributes have circled back to the same idea, that this band represented something increasingly rare in modern music. 3 men who stayed together, stayed loyal, and never let fame pull them apart. With all of that history and loyalty now resting on one remaining man, the real question fans have been asking privately since the news broke is what actually happens next. And Gibbons has already made his answer clear. What happens to ZZ Top now? Gibbons' statement made his intentions unmistakable. The band is going to keep touring, and he described that decision directly as honoring exactly what Frank Beard wanted before he passed. If that sentence sounds familiar, it should, because it mirrors almost word for word the choice Gibbons and Beard made together after losing Dusty Hill 5 years earlier, when they decided that stopping the band would have felt like a second loss stacked on top of the first. Elwood Francis remains in the lineup on bass, and as already noted, Gibbons specifically named him in his tribute statement. A small detail that signals just how central Elwood has become to Gibbons personally, not simply as a hired replacement, but as the closest creative partner he has left standing. The shows in Salt Lake City and Colorado Springs were canceled immediately following Beard's death, but the band was expected to resume touring within days, with previously scheduled weekend shows in Austin, Texas, a return to the very state where this entire story began back in 1969. There is something quietly powerful about that detail. A band born in Texas now returning to Texas soil to play its first shows as a duo, carrying the weight of an entire lineup's history. What remains genuinely uncertain, and this is the part almost no other coverage has addressed clearly, is who permanently takes over the drum chair Beard held for 56 consecutive years. Unlike the transition after Hill's death, when Elwood was already waiting in the wings as a longtime member of the crew, no permanent replacement drummer has been named. John Douglas and Michael Monaghan have both filled in during emergencies over the years, and some fans have already started speculating online about whether Monaghan might be given the permanent nod given his recent fill-in work, though nothing has been confirmed, and Gibbons has not addressed the question directly in any public statement so far. That leaves one of the most storied drum chairs in rock history technically open for the first time in 56 years. Gibbons is now the only original member of Z-Top left standing, still choosing to walk out on stage rather than let the band's story end in silence. And whatever comes next will be written entirely in his voice alone. Billy Gibbons has said goodbye to both of his brothers now, and he is still choosing to play. Tell us in the comments which Frank Beard's song hit you hardest this week.